The army told her to stay back and knit. Hours later, she was saving their lives from a mile away. Sarah looks like an ordinary civilian, but she is actually a retired Navy SEAL, the deadliest sniper in history. When Captain Miller's arrogant unit walks into a frozen death trap, their technology fails and only Sarah's skills can save them. Watch how she dominates the battlefield from the shadows, leaving a humiliated captain speechless and proving that true warriors don't need a uniform. From wherever you're watching, let us know in the comments. And if this story has earned you respect, click like so others can find it too. The cold in the Cascade Range does not simply exist as a condition of the weather. It acts as a predatory force, a sentient weight that presses against the lungs and seeks out the smallest imperfection in a human being's will to survive. And for 55-year-old Sarah Jenkins, the cold was the only thing left in the world that felt completely honest, because it didn't care about rank or history, or the medals that sat in a shoebox under a bed in a cabin that no one visited. She stood on the edge of the staging area, her boots grinding into the permafrost that formed a hard, unyielding crust over the gravel of the trailhead, and she watched the chaotic ballet of the newly arrived tactical unit with the detached curiosity of a wolf watching a herd of deer that had no business being in its territory. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the jagged sawtooth peaks of the eastern ridge, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the snow like reaching fingers, but the light brought no warmth. It only illuminated the millions of ice crystals suspended in the air, creating a glittering haze that made the distance deceptive and the horizon blur. Sarah leaned against the hood of her rusted pickup truck, a vehicle that had survived more winters than the young lieutenant shouting orders 20 yards away had been alive, and she kept her hands tucked deep into the pockets of a wool coat that smelled of wood smoke and gun oil. Beside her stood Maya. At 24, Maya was a stillness in the motion, her presence defined not by what she did, but by how completely she lacked the nervous energy that vibrated off the soldiers in front of them. She had her mother's eyes, gray, watchful, and utterly unimpressed by the display of government-funded force. They weren't supposed to be there. At least that's what the operations commander had made clear 10 minutes ago in a conversation that had been short, sharp, and laced with the specific kind of condescension that men with new equipment reserve for women in old clothes. Captain Miller, a man whose jawline was sharper than his tactical instincts and who wore his authority like a suit that didn't quite fit, had looked at Sarah's weathered face and the hunting rifle in her truck rack with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He saw a local civilian, a mountain guide who had aged out of relevance, someone who might have known the trails once, when they were just lines on a map, but had no business in a classified extraction operation involving high-value targets. "We have the grid coordinates, ma'am," Miller had said, dismissing her offer of assistance without even making eye contact, checking his tablet instead, as if the digital glow of the screen held more truth than the gray sky above them. "This is a federal operation involving hostile elements. Go back to your cabin, keep the girl safe. We don't need locals getting in the line of fire." He hadn't waited for a response because in his world civilians obeyed, and older women in wool coats went home to knit. He had simply turned his back, assuming his authority was the only variable that mattered in the equation of the morning. Sarah hadn't argued, she hadn't listed her credentials. She hadn't told him that the hostile elements he was hunting, a cell of traffickers moving high-value product through the pass, wouldn't be operating on grid coordinates but on wind and shadow and the specific terrifying geometry of the canyon. She had just nodded slowly, the way one nods at a child who insists on touching a hot stove knowing that the lesson is coming, and that it will be painful. Now, watching them prep to move out, Maya shifted her weight, her boots crunching softly in the snow, a sound that was barely audible over the clatter of equipment. "They're too heavy," Maya said quietly, her voice barely a whisper carried away by the biting wind. It wasn't a criticism meant to be heard, it was an observation of physics, a cold calculation of mass and energy. Pack weight is 40 pounds plus weapons and ammunition. They have breaching tools. They have satellite radios. They have ceramic plates. Without snowshoes, they'll sink in the drifts past the tree line. They're moving like they own the ground. Sarah took a sip from her thermos, the coffee inside black and bitter, and hot enough to scald the roof of her mouth, a sensation she welcomed because it focused the mind. "They think the gear buys them competence," Sarah replied, her voice flat and devoid of judgment. "They think the Kevlar makes them bulletproof and the GPS makes them unlost. Let them walk. Let the mountain teach them." It was the hardest part of the life they lived now, the silence. For years, Sarah had existed in the shadows of a world that didn't officially acknowledge women in her role, where the records were redacted before the ink was dry, and the missions were filed under training accidents or logistical support, or simply ceased to exist. She had been a ghost for the Navy, attached to SEAL teams and special activities divisions, not as a door kicker who broke into rooms, but as the eyes that watched over them from 1,000 yards away, the guardian angel, who dealt in windage and elevation. She was the stillness before the storm, the variable that the enemy never accounted for until their chests exploded. But out here in the civilian world, she was just Sarah the widow who fixed generators and cleared snow from driveways and bought groceries with coupons. And Maya was just her daughter, the quiet girl who spent too much time in the woods and didn't have a boyfriend. The unit moved out, a column of 12 men marching toward the timberline with the aggressive confidence of soldiers who haven't yet been humbled by the altitude. Sarah watched them go until the white camouflage faded into the gray of the birch trees, until the sound of their heavy boots faded into the vast indifference of the landscape. "The storm is coming in 3 hours earlier than the forecast," Sarah said, checking the horizon where the sky was bruising a deep purple, a color that looked like a hematoma spreading across the skin of the world. "The pressure is dropping. I can feel it in my ears. The wind is shifting from the north, bringing the ice down from the glaciers." Miller and his team were walking into a blender, a convergence of meteorological violence that would strip them of their technology and leave them shivering in the dark. Maya looked at her mother. She didn't ask what they were going to do because she knew. They didn't need orders from a captain who read maps on a screen. They didn't need permission from a government that had erased their service. They had an obligation to the truth of the ground, to the code that said you do not leave friendly forces to die, even if those friendly forces are arrogant and blind. "Get the cases," Sarah said. It was the only command she gave, and it was spoken with the quiet finality of a judge passing sentence. They moved with a fluidity that contrasted sharply with the jagged, jerky movements of the soldiers who had just left. There was no wasted motion, no adjusting of straps, no clattering of buckles. Sarah walked to the back of the truck and unlocked the heavy steel storage box welded to the bed. The hinges were oiled and silent. Inside, the rifles lay in cut foam like surgical instruments. These weren't modern polymer platforms covered in rails and lasers and flashlights. They were custom-built bolt-action precision instruments, heavy and scarred with barrels that had been hand-lapped and actions that had been trued by master gunsmiths who were now dead. Sarah lifted hers, feeling the familiar weight settle into her shoulder muscles, a reunion with an old friend who knew all her secrets. It was a .300 Winchester Magnum built on a blueprinted action with a heavy contour barrel and a stock made of fiberglass, and Kevlar painted to match the granite and the lichen. It was a tool of absolute honest violence. Maya grabbed the spotting scopes and the drag bags, moving with the efficiency of someone who has drilled this motion 10,000 times. They didn't put on tactical vests or helmets, because out here speed was armor and silence was a shield. They pulled on white oversuits made of simple cotton canvas stained with dirt and pine pitch and streaks of gray paint to match the imperfect texture of the forest floor. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like nothing. They looked like part of the mountain that had decided to stand up and walk. "We take the ridgeline," Sarah said, locking the truck and checking the perimeter one last time. "We stay parallel. We stay unseen. If they complete the mission, we hike back and have dinner. If they don't..." She didn't finish the sentence because in her world, "if" was the most dangerous word in the language, the pivot point between life and a folded flag. They began to climb. The ascent was brutal, vertical, and unforgiving, but Sarah set a pace that was deceptive. Slow, rhythmic, relentless. They didn't break a sweat, because sweat was a death sentence in these temperatures. Sweat froze against the skin, stealing body heat and leading to hypothermia. They breathed through their noses, regulating their heart rates, sinking their bodies to the thinning oxygen. Within an hour, they had gained 1,000 feet of elevation, moving through the dense pine scrub like smoke, twisting between the trees without snapping a twig or disturbing a branch. Below them in the valley floor, they could see the tactical team struggling. The soldiers were post-holing through deep snow, plunging up to their waists with every step, just as Maya had predicted. Their formation was breaking apart, as fatigue set in the heavy packs, dragging them down, the lack of snowshoes turning their aggressive march into a desperate slog. Sarah stopped, raising her binoculars to her eyes, the movement slow and controlled. "Look at the point man," she whispered. Maya raised her glass, her breath held. "He's checking his GPS every 30 seconds. He's not looking at the terrain, he's looking at a screen. Sarah grunted a low sound of disapproval. Fatal funnel. They're walking right into the choke point at the canyon mouth. They are fixated on the destination and ignoring the path. If the traffickers are waiting, that's where they'll be. High ground, cover egress routes. The wind began to pick up, howling through the granite peaks, whipping snow into a blinding frenzy that erased the world. The storm had arrived not as a gradual change but as a sudden violent assault. Visibility dropped to 50 meters, then 20, then 10. The tactical team below disappeared into the whiteout swallowed by the mountain. Radio chatter is spiking, Maya said, tapping the earpiece of the scanner she had clipped to her collar. They're confused. They've lost visual on the objective. Command is telling them to push through because the satellite feed shows the target is stationary. Sarah shook her head, and the movement was filled with a weary sadness. Command is in a warm room in D.C., sitting in ergonomic chairs drinking coffee that someone else made. Command doesn't feel the frostbite or the way the wind sucks the air out of your lungs. They are pushing numbers on a screen, but those boys down there are bleeding real blood. They kept moving, flanking the canyon, climbing higher until they reached a granite shelf overlooking the ambush point. It was a sniper's nest, carved by nature, protected from the direct force of the wind by a wall of rock with a clear line of sight into the killing zone below. They settled in. This was the work, not the shooting. The shooting was the punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. The work was the waiting, the ability to lie perfectly still in freezing temperatures while the body screamed for movement, while the muscles cramped and the mind drifted. Sarah deployed the bipod of her rifle, settling the stock into her shoulder, feeling the cold radiate up through the mat, but ignoring it. Maya set up the spotting scope beside her, checking the lenses for fogging. They became statues. For 2 hours they waited. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on them, attempting to crush their resolve. But Sarah didn't shiver. She went to a place in her mind, a quiet room where pain was just information to be acknowledged and ignored, where the past and the present merged into a single point of focus. She thought about the men she had saved and the men she hadn't. She thought about the silence of the house since her husband died. She thought about the butterfly tattoo on her arm hidden beneath layers of wool and Gore-Tex, a symbol of transformation that no one understood. Below them, the tactical team emerged from the storm, stumbling into the canyon like drunks leaving a bar. They were exhausted. Their discipline had frayed. They were bunched up, seeking comfort in proximity, violating the first rule of spacing. They were loud. They were visible. And then the trap sprung. It wasn't dramatic like a movie with explosions and screaming. It was a dry popping sound, barely audible over the wind, like a branch snapping under the weight of snow. The point man for the tactical team dropped his leg, shattering under the impact of a heavy caliber round fired from the opposite ridge. Then the machine gun opened up. It was a PKM, likely Russian surplus, dug into a fortified position on the high ground. The sound was a rhythmic chugging thump 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 that echoed off the canyon walls, creating a confusing acoustic nightmare. Tracers tore through the snow, sizzling as they hit, pinning the unit down behind a scattering of boulders that offered barely enough cover. They were trapped in the open, taking fire from high ground, unable to maneuver, unable to see their enemy, terrified and confused. "Contact front!" the radio screamed in Maya's ear, the voice high-pitched and bordering on hysteria. "Taking heavy fire. We have casualties. Man down. I repeat, man down. Requesting air support. Requesting immediate extraction." "Negative." The voice of command crackled back, cold and distant, delayed by the satellite lag. "Weather is 0-0. Air assets are grounded. No pilots will fly in this soup. You are on your own. Pull back. Repeat, retreat to extraction point." Sarah watched through her scope, her eye tracing the trajectory of the incoming fire. "They can't retreat," she said softly. "The machine gun has the exit covered. If they move, they die. If they stay, they die. They are in a kill box." Captain Miller was screaming orders, but panic had set in, spreading like a virus. The enemy was invisible, protected by the rocks and the storm. The traffickers were closing in, moving down the slope to finish the job, to flank the unit and wipe them out. The young soldiers were firing blindly, spraying ammunition at rocks, wasting their lives in a panic, trying to fight an enemy they couldn't see with weapons that were freezing up. Sarah adjusted her turret, her gloved fingers moving with precise, delicate clicks. She didn't look at the soldiers. She looked at the enemy ridgeline 800 yards away across the canyon. The wind was gusting full value, left to right, a nightmare for ballistics. The angle was steep. Shooting downhill meant the bullet would hit high if not compensated for. The temperature drop affected the air density, making the air thicker, creating more drag on the bullet. It was a shot that a computer would struggle to calculate in real time. Sarah didn't use a computer. She used 30 years of feeling the air. She used the sensation of the wind on her cheek, the way the snow was drifting the bend of the pine trees. "Range?" Sarah asked. Her voice was devoid of emotion, stripped of all humanity, until only the math remained. 840 meters. Maya replied, her eye glued to the scope, her voice steady as a metronome. "Wind is varying. Gusts to 30 miles per hour from the 3 o'clock. Mirage is flattening. Hold left 4 mils. Elevation up 12. Wait for the lull." Sarah breathed in. The world narrowed down to the crosshairs. She wasn't a mother. She wasn't a widow. She wasn't a civilian. She was a mechanic of trajectory. She found the heat signature of the machine gunner, a blurry shape in the snow, partially obscured by a rock, but visible to those who knew where to look. He was confident. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. "Send it," Maya whispered, sensing the break in the wind. Sarah's finger curled around the trigger. She applied pressure straight back, taking up the slack. The break was crisp like a glass rod snapping. The rifle bucked, driving back into her shoulder, a violent shove that she absorbed with her body weight. There was no sound of the shot reaching the target. The bullet traveled faster than sound. Through the scope, Maya saw the machine gunner simply cease to exist. The pink mist was invisible in the snow, but the kinetic energy was undeniable. He slumped backward, the weapon pointing skyward, falling silent. "Impact," Maya said calmly, marking the hit in her mind. "Target down. 2 more moving to his left. 7 o'clock. They're trying to flank the unit. They have RPGs." Sarah worked the bolt. The metallic clack-clack was the only sound on the ridge, a mechanical heartbeat. She acquired the second target. He was running, moving between cover, trying to reach a firing position. A moving target at 800 yards in a blizzard. Impossible for most. Necessary for her. She led him, tracking the speed of his movement against the flight time of the bullet, calculating the lead in her subconscious. She didn't think about it, she felt it. She fired. The figure crumpled mid-stride, dropping into the snow like a puppet with cut strings. Down in the canyon, the tactical team had stopped firing. They were confused. They heard the cracks of the high-powered rifle from the peaks above them, a distant thunder that rolled over the storm. But they couldn't see who was shooting. They only saw their enemies falling. They saw the machine gun stop. They saw the flankers drop. "Who is that?" Miller's voice cracked over the radio, filled with bewilderment. "Command, do we have assets in the area? Is there another team?" "Negative," came the reply. "You are alone. Retreat immediately." "We're not doing the shooting," Miller yelled, desperation creeping in. "Someone else is engaging. Who is out here?" Sarah ignored the chatter. She was in the rhythm now. Bolt, breath, trigger, recoil, bolt, breath, trigger, recoil. It was a grim accounting. She was balancing the ledger, paying back the debt of incompetence with the currency of violence. The traffickers, realizing they were being hunted by something they couldn't see, something that didn't miss, began to panic. They broke cover, trying to retreat back up the ridge, abandoning their position. 3 running, Maya said. "They're bunching up near the tree line. Let them go." Sarah lowered the rifle, carefully clearing the chamber. "The threat is neutralized. The machine gun is down. The unit can move. We are not here to exterminate, we are here to facilitate." The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. The canyon was still. The tactical team lay behind their rocks, waiting for the next hammer blow, terrified to move. But it didn't come. The wind howled, covering the sound of Sarah and Maya packing their gear. They collected their brass casings, wiping them clean of fingerprints even though the snow would bury them. They left nothing. No trace. No proof. No wrapper from a protein bar, no footprint that wouldn't be filled in by the drift. They melted back into the tree line, descending the mountain as the tactical team cautiously began to treat their wounded and pull back towards the extraction point. The descent was harder on the knees but lighter on the soul. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a dull ache in the joints, but Sarah welcomed it. It was the feeling of a job done. They reached the truck just as the sun began to set, breaking through the storm clouds in a brilliant display of orange and violet that set the snow on fire. They stowed the rifles in the hidden compartment, locking the box with a satisfying click. Sarah poured the last of the coffee. It was lukewarm, but it tasted like victory. She leaned against the truck, watching the road. Half an hour later, the tactical team's vehicles rolled back into the staging area. They looked shattered. The pristine white camouflage was stained with mud and blood. Men were limping. Their gear was torn. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of men who had brushed against death and didn't understand why they were still alive. They were quiet. The joking was gone. The bravado had evaporated in the thin air. Captain Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle. He looked shaken, his face pale, his eyes wide. He saw Sarah leaning against her truck exactly where he had left her, casually holding a thermos cup. He stopped. He stared. He walked over to her slowly, his boots dragging in the gravel. He didn't have his tablet this time. He didn't have his swagger. He stopped 3 feet away, searching her face, scanning her eyes for a sign. He was looking for something. A gloat, a smirk, a hint of, "I told you so." Sarah gave him nothing. Her face was a mask of polite indifference, a reflection of the mountain itself. "You stayed here?" Miller asked, his voice rough, scratching at his throat. "Like you told us to," Sarah said. Her voice was smooth, calm, carrying no weight. "Weather got bad. Hope you boys stayed warm. Did you find what you were looking for?" Miller stared at her. He looked at the truck. He looked at the snow on the tires. He looked at Maya, who was casually reading a paperback book in the passenger seat, turning a page with a quiet rustle. He looked back at Sarah's hands. They were clean scrubbed with snow, but there was a smudge of gun oil on her thumb that she hadn't wiped away. A tiny dark crescent against the skin. Miller's eyes locked onto it. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He did the math, the impossible shots, the timing, the fact that the civilian had predicted the weather and the trap, the fact that the caliber used to save them was a 300 Win Mag, the preferred round of long-range hunters and snipers, not the 5.56 of the military. He swallowed hard. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had dismissed a predator as prey. He had spoken down to a titan. He straightened up. The condescension was gone, washed away by the fear and the awe. He wanted to ask. He wanted to know who she really was. He wanted to know what unit, what history, what ghost story she had walked out of. He wanted to ask for her name again, so he could remember it forever. But he knew the rules. If she wanted him to know, she would have told him. The silence was the answer. The silence was the lesson. Miller took a step back. Slowly, deliberately, he brought his hand up. It wasn't a formal salute. That would have drawn attention from his men, that would have raised questions he couldn't answer. But it was a nod, a distinct lowering of the head and a squaring of the shoulders that acknowledged a superior officer. It was a gesture of submission and profound gratitude. "The wind up there," Miller said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "It was tricky. We couldn't read it." "Wind is only tricky if you fight it," Sarah said, looking him dead in the eye, allowing the mask to slip for just a fraction of a second, allowing him to see the steel beneath the skin. "You have to work with it. You have to listen to what the mountain is telling you. It's not an enemy, Captain, it's just the world." Miller nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, "for the advice. And for watching the weather." "Just doing my job," Sarah replied, turning away to open the driver's door. "Which is clearing driveways and making sure folks don't get lost. You boys be careful on the road out. The ice is black, and it's unforgiving." She got into the truck. The engine turned over with a roar. As they pulled away, Maya looked in the side mirror, watching the captain standing alone in the fading light, a small figure against the vast backdrop of the peaks. "He knows," Maya said quietly, closing her book. "He guesses," Sarah corrected, shifting gears, the truck lurching forward onto the highway. "Knowing requires paperwork. Knowing requires reports and debriefings and questions I don't want to answer. Guessing just requires fear and a little bit of imagination." They drove down the mountain, leaving the unit behind. Sarah didn't turn on the radio. She didn't celebrate. She didn't need the validation of a medal or a thank you from a government that had forgotten her name. She didn't need a parade. She had the cold. She had the rifle. She had her daughter. And she had the truth. The world could play its games of rank and title. It could hand out authority to boys with tablets and ignore the women who held the sky up. But when the storm came and the lines broke, when the chaos descended and the technology failed, the only thing that mattered was who could hold the wind. The only thing that mattered was who could make the shot. And Sarah Jenkins never missed. The truck disappeared around the bend, leaving only tire tracks in the snow that the wind would soon erase. Invisible again, just the way she liked it.